Okay, uh, welcome all to our February convening of the Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis SIGs online seminar series. I'm the SIG chair, James Pustiowski. Before we get started, we've got a special message from Dr. Terry Piggott. I'll throw it over to Terry.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind everyone on this call that applications are open for the Meta-Analysis Training Institute. We will put the website in the chat. You can apply until March 28th. And if you don't know about MADI, as we affectionately call it, it is a 1-week training grant, 1-week workshop that'll take place in Chicago in July. And we will be focusing on advanced methods for meta-analysis. And I do it with my colleagues, Tasha Bareitfis, Ryan Williams, Josh Polanin, and Beth Tipton.
Super. So if you haven't been, definitely get your applications in. Otherwise, you will feel intense fear of missing out during that weekend over the summer. But on to our main topic for today. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Jamaal Young. Dr. Young holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction from Texas A&M, as well as a bachelor's degree from A&M in biomedical engineering. Dr. Young brings experience from a variety of different roles in education, having worked as a high school math and science teacher, consultant with the Texas Education Agency, and now as a professor, starting at University of North Texas before returning to Texas A&M. So I think, does that make you a triple Aggie?
Yes.
Dr. Young's,
not get away from this place.
Dr. Young's scholarship focuses on STEM attainment and identity, examining how the opportunity structures of education and other social determinants affect the trajectories of Black students and other populations that remain underrepresented in STEM. And he often employs research synthesis methodologies in this work, and he's been a longtime contributor to our SIG. So I'm really excited that today he's going to be speaking on the topic of Meta-Analytic QuantCrit. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jamaal Young.
Well, because I'm a triple Aggie, I got to start off with a howdy to kind of get us started. It's just kind of natural for me. And I really first want to thank James and thank the SIG for this opportunity. I was telling Terry before we got on that I just recently transitioned into the position of associate department head for graduate studies at A&M. So I really have needed this opportunity to sit down and get back to my scholarships. This really forced me to dig in there and get some stuff done. So I really want to thank them for this opportunity. For the next few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about Meta-Analytic QuantCrit. Really just exploring the possibilities, thinking about, what can this contribute to what we do? How can we possibly implement some of these tenets within meta-analytics research, and really what this could do to open up our field study. So an overview of how I've broken the presentation down. First, I want to give my positionality. I think it's important for everyone to have my background and see where my perspectives are and how it's going to guide this discussion and guide my approach to Meta-Analytic QuantCrit. Give some background on CRT and QuantCrit, then unpack the QuantCrit tenets within the context of statistical analysis, then jump into the critical inquiry framework and QuantCrit, and finally sum us up with kind of my ideas about how we can implement Meta-Analytic QuantCrit in the field. So to kind of give us a little bit of my background, I'm an African-American male. I'm married to an academic, so that's a very unique part of my positionality. My wife works within multicultural and urban education. Myself work within STEM education. So a lot of my work kind of and our work together kind of crosses both positions. She informs a lot of my work. I inform a lot of her work. I'm also a father of 5 with 1 on the way. And so thinking about the educational outcomes of my children, their experiences in schools are definitely what informs a lot of my work and the things that I investigate. I am a 3rd generation educator. My grandmother was an educator. My mother was an educator. They all informed me not to go into education. So I went into biomedical engineering and then ended up in education, as a lot of people do. So that transition, those experiences with engineering and education are also going to inform what I do. And just kind of want to give you an idea of the fabric of who I am and how that's going to inform my discussions today and how I approach QuantCrit and my research in general. So critical race theory, I'm not going to spend an entirely long time here, but I do want to kind of hit some big points as it relates to our discussion today. If you may know anything about QuantCrit, about critical race theory, the premise of racism is a really, really huge part of the idea of QuantCrit. And in particular, where I really want to spend some time is thinking about how the premise of racism has been embedded within the field of statistics, and how if we're thinking about racism being something that is within different structures of our lives, it's also going to be embedded within how we deal with data, and in particular, how we go about statistical analysis, the traditional statistical analysis that have been here before. Also thinking about ideas about color blindness, equal opportunity, and living within a race-neutral society, and understanding that race should be a part of how we analyze data, what we think about data, we think about learning outcomes in particular, and that we really need to think about how to be very thoughtful in how we address and interact and investigate race within statistical analyses. Third, thinking about the principle of social justice and thinking about how we can use data to inform policies and practices and structures to help support and inevitably change the way our society functions. And then finally, 4 and 5, thinking about wanting to center the voices of marginalized and oppressed populations. Definitely want to provide voice and insight from those individuals. I remember early in my career, a lot of discussions, a lot of questions during my annual evaluations were always kind of centered on, okay, you're in math ed, but why are you always studying, Black children? There are other children in classrooms. And so, once QuantCrit and critical race theory really start to grow legs, it really helped me to have some good theoretical and empirical and just really some good citations to give to people as to why my approaches and my focus was on that particular population. As I saw within math there wasn't a whole lot that was there looking at specifically quantitative research involved with those particular populations, aside from achievement gap studies that were going on. And then finally, critical race theory really situates interdisciplinary research. As a STEM educator, I think that science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are definitely interdisciplinary, but I also think that when we're thinking about race, racism, and building better supports for all children, it definitely has to be an interdisciplinary effort. We definitely have to think about how sociology is involved with education, within statistics, and so on and so forth, how we all can work together with our different levels of expertise to build, again, better models, better structures for our society. So we're going to spend a lot of time in our discussion really unpacking these 5 tenets of QuantCrit, starting with the centrality of racism, thinking about how the fact that racism is at the center of a lot of what we do in statistics, talking about numbers and how they're not neutral, thinking about how we categorize and operationalize data, thinking about this whole idea of voice and insight and kind of the affordances of that, some of the constraints of that, to make sure that, when we're presenting data, we are giving it context, we are giving our positionality, but at the same time, we're not speaking beyond the data. And then finally, thinking about how we can use data to inform social justice activities and programs. So tenet 1, centrality of racism. The first thing I want to do before I kind of dig into this is spend some time giving some definitions and kind of giving my particular perspective on these definitions. I'm going to start with centrality. There's 2 common definitions for the word centrality. The first one is the quality or fact of being in the middle or of somewhere or something. And the second is the quality of being essential or of greatest importance. For the discussion today and kind of in my personal perspective and positionality and kind of how I approach things, I am more of the understanding of the first definition of centrality. I believe that it's that racism in the middle of a lot of things in our American society. I don't believe that it is the essential or the greatest importance of any discussions that we have, but it is definitely something that was always and will always be in the center and in the middle of all of our discussions. And for us today, in the center and in the middle of our discussion about statistics. The second term that I want to spend a little bit of time defining is racism. I think a lot of times we present and we talk about racism without giving a definition, giving everyone a common foundation on how we're approaching and talking about racism. So for our discussion today, we're going to define racism as the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. And I think that's an important definition to use within this context, because a lot of the discussion we'll talk about are going to be, well, you know, that's just good research practice, for instance, comparing different populations of students. And then, you know, but with this definition and thinking about how that may possibly identify characteristics of one group and then outcomes on, let's say, achievement, and then that comparison inevitably creates a superior group and an inferior group, and how that feeds the idea of racism will kind of give us a little bit more of a kind of common understanding of the discussion as we build into and kind of move through this discussion. So taking those two ideas together, the way we're going to really think about this first tenet is going to be within the context that racism is in the center and in the middle of our discussions about statistics. It's something that has been there for a long time. There are numerous books as cited here that have really discussed about racism and its influence on statistical practice. And so those things kind of help to remind us this is not a new idea. QuantCrit is really just bringing this to light, but we've always had these books and these ideas and these discussions about how race and statistics kind of intersect and what we really want to do or kind of better understand about that relationship. The second tenet of QuantCrit is that numbers are not neutral. And so this idea is built on the idea that data is produced by humans. You're going to bring in your baggage, your political entanglements, your social historical kind of ideas into the creation of statistical knowledge, and in particular data, and as well the representation of that data. And so kind of example of why, you know, this tenet exists, if you look at these two graphs from the NAEP, the first one, if you go into the NAEP, you've done any work with the NAEP, and you're looking at their achievement section, one of the first things that the NAEP is going to present to you is going to be an achievement gap. And this has been historically, since the NAEP began, has always been something that has been at the forefront of the national discussions about student achievement. The first figure that you'll see, the one at the top, will always be a comparison of white students to Black students. I mean, that's just the natural default that you see. And thinking about, okay, why this is the first thing that we're presented with. Why are these two groups the groups that are there? And really kind of unpacking what this figure really tells us and doesn't really tell us. You're looking at it, starts in 1990 and it's going all the way to 2022. And if you notice, like the gap really hasn't changed. Overall, there's been what a 4 point difference in there. I mean, it hasn't really been a lot that has changed in there as far as like the gaps between the two groups of students. The bigger idea here, and I'm always interested in, is that if you really take some time to critique what this graph is showing us, it's showing us that essentially the learning trajectories are about the same. So the slopes for white students and Black students are about the same. So the gap is really not changing because their slopes are essentially the same. In order for you to really and truly close this achievement gap, you're going to need to increase the slope of African-American students. And this gap on this graph really doesn't show that that's ever really been done. Those slopes are essentially the same throughout time. And kind of one of the alternatives, or kind of a different perspective, would be to look at the achievement differences between Asian American students and white students. And again, you notice there's a very, very small difference between those. with Asian students slightly outperforming white students. And this is presented here to show that this is something that is not really talked about, but it's very, very well known. However, we consistently focus on the achievement gap between white and Black students, and that's something that's very, very well known as well. And so just kind of the choice and the decision on how and what you present really has to be taken into account, and understanding that numbers and data, they have power, they have meaning. These things are not neutral ideas. Tenet 3, categories are neither natural nor given. One of the big things that I really want to kind of drive home with this discussion is that even ideas such as race, they're not really given, or they're not really fully contextualized as they are traditionally presented. So for instance, if you think about Asian students and what an Asian student population kind of consists of, generally those groups are lumped together, and we rarely see the sub populations in their data. And so thinking about how we traditionally present this data, there's so much that's lost about the groups and within group differences. So thinking about, okay, when we talk about Asian, well, you're also lumping in Asian Indian students with Chinese students, with Korean students. And we're looking at this particular figure that looks at educational attainment and bachelor degrees or higher. There are differences there within this group that we're calling Asian. And a lot of times we're not able to think about this variation because we're lumping these groups together. The same thing happens when we look at African-American students, and we don't do the intersectional analysis of African-American male versus African-American female students. We definitely have to start to disaggregate data and realize that there's so much more than just the racial groups that needs to be analyzed and needs to be unpacked, that needs to be presented to help inform and help us to make better decisions about education for all students. Tenet 4 speaks to the idea of voice and insight. And really what we're looking at here is the idea that all data are socially constructed. And I think for us as meta-analysis, we really can think about this first point, that social research is shaped by researchers and usually funders. If you conducting meta-analysis, you realize that the funding opportunities for you are very limited, and it's based on what people value. I think this is a very, very important idea just for us in general, to think about how what gets funded is going to be determined by people's perspectives, people's ideals, and so on and so forth. Also, as you're designing your studies as an individual researcher, thinking about what data you're going to collect, the methods you're going to use, who you're going to include. These are all very, very important considerations. And then kind of bringing it back together, that idea of voice and insight and your positionality, experience, knowledge, those things matter. But more so, what we have to think about is, I know that it's been said by a very, very influential person within meta-analyses that meta-analysis is a team sport. And so when we're thinking about this voice and insight, our positionality, our experiences matter, but also the voices and experiences of those that we're studying are important. So thinking about bringing in, for instance, if you're working on a study on African-American girls and the influence on math identity, bringing African-American girls into the data analysis process, the data collection process, and then once you have your results, making sure that they can understand those results and kind of getting their feedback about those results. It's also how you can add that voice and insight piece into your work, because that's the population which you're focused on, and kind of having their voice and their insight to inform not only just the collection and analysis, but the reporting of the information about them, I think is very, very critical piece of QuantCrit. And then finally, the final tenet of QuantCrit is using numbers for social justice. Again, I want to take a short amount of time to talk about how I'm defining social justice. I think it's another one of those terms that doesn't really get defined in a lot of discussions. And so for our discussion today, we're going to define social justice as the equitable distribution of resources among members of a community and the respect of rights of minoritized populations. So when we're thinking about social justice, and in particular using numbers for social justice, I thought this is a very good example of how we can definitely make this information accessible and at the same time use it to affect change. So here's a study that was done on diversity in children's books in 2015. And you can see 3 years later, 2018, there was some changes that were made on the idea, on the structure of Georgia Bush representation. I think across the board, there are differences there. In particular, you had more than double the representation of Latinx students from 2015 to 2018. The same happened with Asian populations. There was an increase in the African-American student population. Even the animal representation increased from 2015 to 2018. But then there's this idea about equity and kind of what has to happen for these changes to take place. So in order for that shift to take place in representation, there also had to be a shift in the representation of white students in these books, and kind of thinking about, how that happens and why that may need to happen. And historically, putting all these things in context is very, very important idea when we're thinking about using numbers for social justice. And then finally, when we're thinking about using numbers for social justice, we really want to think at the structural level. We want to think, how can we influence change in social, political, and economic structures? Because these are the areas in which the underlying problems are created, that people are facing within our society. So kind of bringing that all together, we're going to use the critical inquiry framework. And essentially what this framework does is it gives us a kind of a foundation to discuss QuantCrit in context of statistical analysis, to kind of really unpack that before we move into specifically meta-analytic work. And so when we think about any type of inquiry that takes place, the first place we want to start is with our research questions. The research questions are going to drive your study, whether it's qualitative or it's quantitative. And there's this bi-directional relationship between your research questions and policy and advocacy, as well as with conceptual frameworks and theories. And so that is really an important piece as it relates to QuantCrit, kind of giving us a kind of a jump off point. So when we think about the centrality of racism, what we really want to spend a little bit of time at the onset of our study design is thinking about decentering racism within the research questions. And so how we can kind of think about that is to first really take a critical review of our research questions and consider, through this research questions, what are going to be the implications for policy and advocacy? And are those implications going to have a negative influence on particular populations? Is it going to lead to policies and policies and programs to influence change? Can it be guided by particular conceptual frameworks that will help to unpack and kind of contextualize my results? And just thinking about that at the beginning is going to be key to helping to decenter racism within the research question. Thinking about tenet number 2, how numbers are not neutral, is really important to consider how your conceptual frameworks, your theoretical frameworks can be used to help you to understand and unpack the concepts and constructs under investigation, and really take into account their meaning in a very, very insightful and purposeful manner. Tenets 3 and 4 really have to do with the data collection, analysis of your data. Tenet 3, thinking about the idea that categories are neither natural nor neutral. Whenever you're thinking about the different populations in which you're describing or you're using within any type of analysis, taking some time to think about, am I really describing this population as best as I can? Am I including important factors about this population that may not be readily available, or I should say more clearly apparent? And then how am I incorporating voice and insight? How am I thinking about my positionality within this data? And how am I making sure that the voice and the perspectives of traditionally minoritized populations are also involved in the analysis and within the reporting of the data? And then finally, thinking about tenet 5, using numbers for social justice. How can I ensure that the results of this study are going to inform policy and going to inform advocacy for traditionally marginalized populations and help to decenter racism in our society? So thinking about Tenet 1 within the context of the critical inquiry framework, again, we want to think about our research questions and how can we decenter those, decenter racism within those research questions. And one way to do that is use critical race theory to critique those questions and kind of think about that within the context of policy and conceptual frameworks. Within Tenet 2, when you're really thinking about numbers not being neutral, it's important that the underlying meaning of numbers and data are considered in conjunction with your positionality and designing your research study. So thinking about how your positionality can be used to help inform your thoughts about what these numbers mean, where these numbers are coming from, and how these numbers can be used. And then really this should take place during the problem development process, and thinking about how CRT and other theories can help you in developing your problem and unpacking your problem in a meaningful way. Tenet 3 categories are neither natural nor nor given. Really, this is talking about how you're going to operationalize and characterize particular groups, particularly when you're thinking about groups from racially diverse populations, thinking about disaggregating that data, making sure there are factors that are brought to light and incorporated within your analysis to really capture a non-deficit perspective of those particular participants, giving the researchers and giving the readers a full picture. I think here is where your descriptive statistic and the descriptive data that you provide is also very important. We as meta-analysts know that stuff a lot of times is not provided. So if we want to go back in and calculate particular effect sizes for different populations, a lot of times in the descriptive statistics, we're not provided with that information. So thinking about this is another way to kind of help us to make sure that full picture of data is provided, because we understand that these categories for race are not natural. There's so much more incorporated with that idea. And then Tenet 4, again, the idea of voice and insight, thinking about bringing in your perspective as well as perspectives of others to help make sure that your positionality does not overly inform the analysis and reporting, and to make sure the voice of those that you're using within the analysis is given some opportunity to kind of give you some pushback, give you some feedback, give you really their perspective on how you characterize their performance on that particular intervention or in that particular analysis. And then finally, using numbers for social justice, we definitely want to make sure that there's some type of advocacy and policy implication provided that really and truly helps us to think about how we can affect structural change. For a lot of us within education, we're going to think about educational policy. We're going to think about how we can use this data to inform classroom practices, but that really has to be at the heart of using numbers, and particularly using data and results to affect social justice. And so now moving into kind of the focus in on what this can be done within a meta-analytic lens. What we really want to think about are kind of the processes and the qualities of a high quality meta-analysis. And we were provided by some meta-analytic superstars a good framework to start with. And I've kind of collapsed these down into 3 different categories. So a problem formulation, kind of data collection that I'll talk about, the analysis piece, and then kind of the reporting of the effects, and how we can use Meta-Analytic QuantCrit to kind of capture high quality meta-analysis within a systematic review structure. So to start with Tenet 1, the centrality of racism in meta-analytic studies, we want to start with the idea of research question for meta-analysis focused on summarizing effect sizes. So there's some common effect sizes that we would typically summarize, and these are ideas like treatment effects, differences between groups, associations, and prevalence of phenomenon. So treatment effects are probably the most common. For me in the world of math ed and STEM education, we're looking at the influences of teaching practices, for instance, integration of technology, things of that nature. How do those treatments affect student performance? We also look at differences between groups. So differences between racial groups, differences between students with different levels of prior performance. We look at associations. So what's the relationship between the students' mathematics identity and their performance? And the prevalence of different phenomena is also very common. For instance, looking at students' mathematics anxiety and that influence on learning outcomes. But when we're thinking about this from the idea of QuantCrit, we really want to think about the research questions, and in particular, how we're doing our analysis and how we can decenter racism within that particular research question. So what you really want to think about from a QuantCrit perspective is think within rather than between. So you really want to think about asking meta-analytic research questions that look at between group differences. Look at within group differences rather than between group differences. For example, so if you're looking at, let's say, African-American students, you don't really want to look at the performance of African-American students compared to other students. Rather, think about ways you can look at within group differences. So how do African-American students think about how do African-American students perform in relation to their mathematics identity? How do African-American students, what's the prevalence of math anxiety within the population of African-American students? Really taking the focus off of comparing groups and focusing in on, okay, how can we support this particular group specifically? So again, thinking more within the group rather than between the group, and how we can really use this data to inform particular interventions, policies, and practices for particular groups. This has several important implications because when we kind of take away that between group distractor and we're no longer focused on, okay, how do they compare to others, we really can unpack and uncover some really, really good information to support that particular group's performance and really inform policy for that particular group. For tenets 2 and 3, thinking about numbers as numbers and categories as not neutral. When you're thinking about the meta-analytic design, the data collection, it's important that you're coding a moderator of effect size variability. And so one thing you want to make sure you're doing is providing some rationale for your coding schema. And in particular, that needs to be stated a priori, your hypotheses and why your effect sizes vary across studies, and kind of give some clear rationale as to why these moderators are chosen and why you think they're going to influence the data. But what is the rationale for that coding schema? And so QuantCrit kind of helps you to unpack or kind of think about how to design that rationale for your coding schema. So when you're thinking about underlying meaning of numbers and data, how that must be considered when defining concepts and inclusion and criteria, exclusion criteria for meta-analysis, you want to think whose numbers are these? So when you're collecting data, you want to think about where this data is coming from. Is it coming from a national data set? Is it coming from an individual classroom? Is it coming from an urban population? Is it coming from a rural population? Those types of things are very important when you're thinking about whose data these are and how you're collecting and categorizing that particular data. When you're thinking about how things are operationalized, realizing that because categories are not natural or given, we operationalize things like race within your study, thinking about what other information needs to be extracted to characterize that population as best as possible. And then finally, you want to use conceptual and theoretical definitions to underlie conceptually relevant data for extracting and coding related to race, gender, and diversity equity related data. Well, you really want to find beyond just CRT, other equity-focused frameworks that can help to inform the data collection, extraction process. I think these will help you to think about things you may not have thought about before. So one that I typically like to look at is the opportunity propensity framework. I think that gives me some good moderators to think about, like student prior performance, thinking about how does opportunities to learn, such as teacher quality, class size, so on and so forth. Those factors being very important moderators to think about when we're kind of printing a complete picture of a particular student. The kind of takeaway for tenets 2 and 3 is you want to consider using CRT and other equity-focused theories to develop a rationale for your coding schema. So you're thinking about how you're going to develop your coding schema, how you're going to assign or extract data, how you're going to identify moderators. You want to think about making that those decisions based on CRT and other equity-focused theories to kind of help you get a full picture of that data. As far as voice and insight is concerned within meta-analysis, you want to think about voice and insight in terms of the analysis process. So there's some common things you want to do within a meta-analysis. Go to compute and report all effect sizes, identify your missing data and address that, report all your mean effect sizes, and then really deal with dependent effect sizes and explore heterogeneity among different effect sizes. So some considerations within a QuantCrit lens for data analysis and reporting. When you're computing effect sizes for data of traditionally minoritized populations of color, they're likely going to come from larger non-equity focused projects. And so because they're coming from the larger projects, they're likely going to be dependent effect sizes. So we definitely want to make sure we're treating those data accordingly. There's a lot of really, really good information about how to deal with the dependent effect sizes. But when you're thinking about doing these studies within a QuantCrit lens and you're kind of extracting this data for these larger data sets, a lot of it's going to be from dependent effect sizes. The other piece that you'll realize when you're doing this type of work that kind of has equity focus, a lot of the studies you're going to include are going to be non-published studies. You're gonna have a lot more conference papers, a lot more dissertations, just because the research question you're tending to ask are not gonna be more mainstream research questions. So you definitely want to make sure you're accounting for that. And then many of the important moderators arrive kind of like from your voice and insight or presented to you by any students or community members you bring in. They may not be provided in primary studies. So thinking about how you're gonna deal with that missing data is also going to be very, very important. So the major takeaway when we're thinking about Tenet 4 and voice and insight is going to be to be aware of the affordances and constraint of your positionality as you provide voice and insight, and kind of understanding, you know, that there are going to be some limitations with this idea of voice and insight, and those are going to have influences and impacts on your data collection, your analysis, and then finally the reporting of data in a meta-analysis. And then finally for Tenet 5, using numbers for social justice. This is really the culmination of everything. So you think about the reporting of meta-analyses, there's some important things you want to consider. You definitely want to publish a protocol and also the meta-analysis data and analysis code. This is very important, especially when we're thinking about the ideas of QuantCrit. There's been an emergent idea. Publishing those protocols and making that data available is essential to building these ideas, having other people unpack and critique this, and kind of giving other people access to your thoughts and kind of the underlying processes that you use to develop this meta-analysis within a QuantCrit lens. A lot of that information is probably not going to be published in the actual paper. So that protocol becomes very important because they're going to probably take out a lot of that data just for space. But kind of providing that within a published protocol is important because it helps to build the field and helps to build the knowledge base related to this. Interpreting the meta-analysis results and their limitations. Effect size transformation is going to be important, moderator and covariant description, and then finally translating your data for your particular audience is going to be extremely important. So when we're thinking about using meta-analytic data for social justice, we want to think about the idea of each one, reach one, teach one, and that really connects to the idea that as you're developing these processes, you have to spread this knowledge, you have to spread this information, you have to invite others in. So when you're working on this, these types of studies, think about bringing in other members and kind of unpacking these ideas together and helping to kind of build a network of people that are doing this work. Again, this can be done through publishing protocols, making your data accessible, but we each have to work together to develop the methods and the policy and the practices around this idea of meta-analytic QuantCrit. Transforming effect sizes back to natural metrics is essentially cracking the code for non-research professionals. This is extremely important, and we're thinking about from a social justice lens. Policymakers and people that are going to actually take this information and use it in practice, like teachers, they really need us to kind of go back and put our data back into its natural metrics where it makes sense. So if you have something that is initially based on test scores, giving them information or giving them results in terms of what it means for their test scores is going to be so much more important than just leaving the overall effect sizes in that kind of analyzed output form. So really thinking about that is going to be really key to helping us kind of translate this data into a manner in which it can be used to affect structural change within classrooms and within society. And so the takeaway from Tenet 5 is going to be translating the results of meta-analysis for multiple audiences is the key to using meta-analytic data for social justice. So definitely making sure that if we're not already doing that, we take time to translate that data into multiple audiences, and then provide some context and important implications for practice. And then kind of bringing everything together. I just kind of have a preliminary framework for Meta-Analytic QuantCrit. It starts with the idea that QuantCrit meta-analytic research questions should decenter racism. So you definitely want to think within rather than between. But whenever you're designing a analysis, you want to kind of apply a Meta-Analytic QuantCrit lens. You think about, okay, am I comparing different groups to each other? If I am, can I think about ways to maybe look at a within group analysis rather than the between group analysis, as that really kind of helps us to think about more non-deficit approaches to analysis. And again, that idea of your research questions decentering racism is going to connect to the coding schema as well as your reporting for social justice. The other element is going to be QuantCrit meta-analysis research requires a coding schema. And in particular, that coding schema must be in the essence of QuantCrit and for a CRT and equity focus. So thinking about how can I find theories along with critical race theories to help improve or help inform, I should say, the coding of my data is going to be key to focusing in on Meta-Analytic QuantCrit. And then how that's going to connect to the research question, and then also connecting to your data analysis. So when you're thinking about data analysis, QuantCrit meta-analysis should provide voice and insight, realizing that your positionality matters. Your experience is definitely something that should inform the data analysis and reporting, but also thinking about bringing in others and their voices and their perspectives to kind of help you manage the affordances and the constraints of your own positionality is also vital to Meta-Analytic QuantCrit. And then finally, realizing that QuantCrit meta-analytic research promotes social justice, and wanting to think about how can I use data to dismantle structural barriers? How can I use this data to inform practice in the classroom, to inform policies, to support students that are traditionally marginalized, and open up equitable structures within our society? And at this point, I have some time here for questions, if we have any within the chat.
Thank you so much, Jamaal. That was really wide ranging, and there's a lot of recommendations to mull over there. We had some questions in the chat and I think Mega is going to moderate for us. And as we go on, if folks have further questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We can call on you, or raise your hand and we can call on you.
All right, I'm going to read the questions out loud. Erica Paul has questions. Any thoughts about connections between methods to combat publication bias and social justice in research?
That one is a big question. I mull over that a lot because, as I stated, that's going to be a huge consideration, given that a lot of the data you're going to be bringing in is going to come from dissertations and unpublished literature. I think that that's probably beyond my methodological background. I think that's definitely something that really needs to be addressed from the psychometrician, statistician type of perspective. I think it's a definite, important kind of lingering question that needs to really be fully addressed as we're thinking about this, not just within QuantCrit, within any types of research questions that typically are going to lend themselves to be better addressed with non-published data.
And Erica has another question. What is the response to researchers who say that incorporating QuantCrit tenets to meta-analysis is hampered by the definitions, methods, and samples of prior research that is being synthesized?
So that that's going to be a limitation. I think, you're going to always have this idea, and I think that's a common problem across meta-analysis. It's not a problem that's new to this idea of QuantCrit. You're always going to want to ask questions and want more data from studies. I think that definitely finding ways to incorporate theories and using those theories to kind of guide the data that you're collecting will help you to kind of really have a focused idea, but it's always going to be a problem. It's a problem that we face anytime we approach any meta-analysis. But I think that the one thing that helps you kind of unpack that within limitations, having that theory and say, okay, these are things that I wanted to address because they are important because of X, Y, or Z, but just given the limitation of the data that it just wasn't there. I think that's the piece that really kind of having that theory and having that good conceptual framework guiding what you're doing helps you to unpack those questions, those situations where that data is not provided for you.
All right, a question from Amy Riegelman. Regarding voice and insight, I would love to see examples of stakeholders joining research teams conducting systematic reviews and meta-analysis. I'm a librarian, and while my expertise is identifying the relevant studies, I'm often working with teams of researchers who are brand new to the methodology. I want to be able to advocate for population and Piggott inclusion as research team members. Would love to be able to point to examples of this being done, specifically with evidence synthesis.
Yeah, I think where I see this most commonly done is within scoping reviews. It's actually a very, very important piece of scoping. A lot of scoping review structures is to have participants from the community and stakeholders involved in that. So maybe borrowing some of the ideas and some of the practices from scoping reviews and bringing those into meta-analysis may be a good just initial way to build some momentum within that area. But yeah, that's a great point.
Question from Dan Fitzpatrick. I know that incorporating any kind of quality assessment in meta-analysis runs into trouble very quickly. Most of the time, the closest we get is splitting the final sample into experimental and other designs. How have you thought about any appraisal of the validity of findings of primary studies based on how critical or not they were?
That is a great question. One thing that we are really behind about a bit with this in general is within QuantCrit, we don't really have the same level of quality assessment development that we have kind of in traditional frameworks and traditional kind of approaches. And so I think it's going to start with developing first some instrumentation to help us to at least start to try to measure this. And then thinking about, okay, well, if we measure this, how do we want to use this data? And how can it, inform our practices? And I think one thing that we have to start to kind of think about is what's going to be the purpose of that? And as we're doing our inclusion criteria, if we're saying, okay, we're only going to have kind of a critical data that we're incorporating in the meta-analysis, how are we then going to use this appraisal to situate that? And I think that's the part that we really have to work out is what do we think is going to be the purpose of that data, and how do we then kind of incorporate that into the analysis? I think we really have to address that first part of that. How are we going to use that data and what's going to be the purpose of that data? And once we kind of figure that out and develop the instrumentation, I think we can work from there to kind of get that into the practice in the field.
Question from Sarah.
I'm going to be a jerk. It's not a question.
Go for it.
Just to add on to, I think, a very great reflection on the limitations of primary studies and being able to use journal articles to kind of call those things out, or as a way to call people into asking different kinds of questions in their studies. I would also say a thing for us to think about as a group that I think is consistent with a lot of critical scholarship is that as researchers, we're also actors in a system. And a lot of those kinds of questions to me are questions about how do you organize a group of researchers to do their work differently. And so I would add, in addition to using journal articles as a means for doing that, learn from organizers and spend time actually talking to colleagues about the shifts that are needed in order to support critical research at all levels.
Very, very informative. I would definitely have to piggyback. That's a great idea. Thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah. There was also Amanda Thomas in the chat dropped a link to a recently published piece that she worked on with a colleague called Deeper Than Wordplay: A Systematic Review of Critical Quantitative Approaches in Education Research. That's in the Review of Education Research. I think it's forthcoming. So that's a systematic review on critical quantitative methodologies. And you can get the link in the chat. Question from Sung Woo.
I can read it out loud. Thank you so much for the great lecture. In terms of the within group differences, I know this type of information is typically not reported, but do you have any experience of analyzing first generation immigrant group and second, third generation within the same racial groups? I want to learn if there's any way to analyze this unique data.
So that particular data is going to be difficult to get a hold on. What I have seen when you're thinking about specific groups that I've seen people find success doing are thinking about some of these assessments that are consistently given each year. So thinking about things like SAT, NAEP, AP exams, a lot of these national exams, and maybe meta-analyzing that data, kind of going in a different way. They really just kind of to build in kind of that idea, but some of those things in a primary study is just not going to be provided. So you're looking for different ways kind of to get that data and analyze that data. That may be a lens or a way that you kind of approach or thinking about that.
Jamaal had a question. So one of your points was about focusing on within group differences rather than between group comparisons. And
correct.
I think I understand. I mean, I understand where that's coming from in terms of like, not kind of reinforcing people's sort of essentialist interpretations of differences in performance from different race or ethnicity groups, right? So right, the point being keeping the focus on the racism of the system rather than right, like essential differences between groups. But I was still kind of surprised by it in that, like, when I think about using like doing moderator analysis and meta-analysis, right? You might be looking at, well, are there differences in effects depending for different subgroups of students? Like, maybe an intervention is more effective when done with white students than with Black students or some other category. And I guess would you say that your recommendation still applies to analysis like that? Because it seems like there the focus is on, it's really about like who benefits from the resources that are provided in the education system rather than like a reflection on the students themselves.
Right. And I think it really just depends on the context. I had a colleague of mine that did an intervention where he taught mathematics from a culturally relevant lens to a group of white students. And he found that their achievement went down. So he kind of looked at it, from, okay, I'm going to teach it using kind of a hip hop pedagogy for a group of white students. And he found that intervention had negative effects on their achievement. And so I think when we're thinking about particular interventions, we got to think about, okay, how was this intervention designed and who was it designed for? And if we really go back and kind of look at mathematical achievement over time, particularly looking at that NAEP graph, as you saw, their slopes or their achievement has really kind of been the same. Like they're growing, their achievement growth has been the same. Well, unless you find a way to accelerate that growth, you're not really going to be able to close achievement gaps. So I really think that within meta-analyses and thinking about how we address subgroup analysis, there definitely is some potential with that can be continuously utilized, but it's really about, okay, unpacking that and making sure we're thinking about how we explain those differences to where that the outcomes are not compared based on the groups, but based on kind of the growth or based on the impact of that particular intervention for those particular groups. So kind of just making sure that, again, when you're translating that data into natural metrics, that you're keeping that in the focus and in the discussion and kind of making sure that those ideas don't kind of creep in. And again, I think a lot of this has to do with the research question that you start off with. And within I think the other thing about this is important to kind of to talk about is this is all kind of in the context of QuantCrit. And so there's going to be very specific types of questions that you're going to ask that may not be the same as if you're doing traditional meta-analysis. From a traditional lens, that's completely fine because your question is more or less going to be on what are the effects of this intervention on, all students. Whereas within a QuantCrit lens, that question is going to probably shift a bit.
I see what you mean. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Just before we wrap up here, Terry, can you toss out another reminder?
Yes, one more reminder. Applications are open for the Meta-Analysis Training Institute, as we affectionately call it, MATI. Those are due at the end of March, and we will put the website in the chat again. And also, please do join us for our talk in the seminar series next month. It's March 17th with Dr. Sarah Pico-Spicer. Her title is Lessons Learned from a Participatory Evidence Synthesis. So I think there'll be a lot of resonance with what we've been talking about today. And I look forward to continuing this discussion. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Jamaal Young, for joining us today and sharing this work with us. It's really, really provocative. And it's a lot for our community to keep considering here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.